It's important for businesses to consider not only the events that are happening or scheduled around them, but to really take into account those events going on around the country and around the globe that could result in unrest locally.
You're listening to the Employee Safety Podcast from Alert Media, a podcast for professionals responsible for the safety and well-being of their employees. Each episode features an interview with a leader in employee safety to discuss how to protect your employees from a wide array of threats, from severe weather to a global pandemic. Let's get into the show.
Hello, and welcome to the Employee Safety Podcast. I'm Sarah Prattley, and I'll be your host for this episode. Some of you may actually remember me from last year. I had the fortune to be a guest on the show with Peter. And at the time, he and I talked about the importance of threat intelligence. And I'm really excited to be back to discuss that topic in more detail as we wrap up yet another year. So in today's episode, we will take a look back at some of the threats that organizations faced in 2021, and then talk about the top threats that you should be prepared for in 2022 to both better protect your people and your businesses. I want to start the conversation with physical threats. These are the ones that, of course, often are not predictable, which can, of course, make them harder to manage, but incredibly important for us to be prepared for and as prepared as possible. And when we look back at recent years, it's active shooters, it's mass shootings, those situations that end up being very high on the list of concerns to businesses. As we at Alert Media talk to customers, the concern over active shooters comes up time and time again as one of their greatest concerns. And unfortunately, many of us are all too familiar with the trend line here when it comes to these incidents. Active shooter situations continue to be on the rise in the US and have been for the last few decades, according to the FBI. And the pandemic did offer a slight reprieve. That's some good news, particularly if you look back at 2020. And the good news is that the number of active shooters at businesses and in public places actually went down that year as well. And many experts do attribute this largely to the pandemic conditions. A lot of things that you could understand there, right? More people staying at home, not many situations where mass crowds were gathered, and of course, a massive move towards remote work. And as we've all experienced in the past year in the US, however, even with spikes in numbers with the pandemic over different points, also concerning variants and spread, there has been more of a return to public life, more events coming back, more workers going back into the office, even in hybrid situations. And with that, it does appear that the trend could shift back towards those pre-2020 situations and numbers when it comes to these shooting incidents and active shooter incidents in particular. Another physical threat and crime trend that is very much at the top of people's mind that I really want to mention that as we get into the holiday season and as we get into next year is these recent smash and grab robberies that we've also been seeing make headlines across the country. Groups of brazen and often armed thieves that are ransacking high-end retail stores, grabbing mounds of merchandise each time. This trend has continued to tick up in recent weeks, and there's certainly a risk that as we've gotten more attention on these, unfortunately, more groups will follow suit, and we could see repeat offenders as well. It's absolutely a risk to prepare for in 2022 and something that our teams at Alert Media will be keeping a close eye on as well. Another pretty universal trend that has been on the rise in recent years is this rise in demonstrations and civil unrest. And this is not exclusive to the US or North America for that matter. This is widely being seen around the entirety of the globe. Activism is absolutely on the rise. In fact, the number of public demonstrations and protest has increased by more than 200% over the past 40 years, 10% alone in 2020. And this certainly is continuing over the past year and is definitely something we expect to see in the year to come. So we've also continued to see unrest bleed beyond the location of an event where something was rooted, right? So it's happened on numerous occasions this year and in recent years in the US and beyond, something like an officer involved shooting in one location. And as news of the event travels through media and social media, eruptions of demonstrations in cities across the country and sometimes around the globe have been happening. This is definitely a trend we expect to continue to see in the future. I'd mention a few things about demonstrations and activism here as well. It's important for businesses to consider not only the events that are happening or scheduled around them, but to really take into account and consideration those events going on around the country and around the globe that could result in unrest locally. Of course, these events generally trend towards public areas and most impact businesses that are in close proximity. And then it's also really good to note here as well that though these demonstrations, activism, unrest spawn violence between protesting groups and looting on occasion, vandalism on occasion as well, a majority of demonstrations actually pose disruptions to traffic and more of an inconvenience locally more than anything. And that's just important to point out as we plan for business coming up next year as well. Beyond these important physical threats to businesses and to employees, another important focus and an area of focus are the economic threats that have truly grown in size and scope in recent months and are being forecast to trend well into 2022 and, based on some experts, likely into 2023 as well. So supply chain, right? That's likely one of the buzzwords from this past year. It's hard to have a conversation about your business life or personal life without this coming up. Chip shortages, cargo ships backed up at ports, goods in warehouses not able to get out to consumers because of the lack of truck drivers. The list of these topics goes on. And unfortunately, experts have for months been discussing the ripple effects that we in the US and the entire global economy will continue to feel throughout 2022. Both Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen here in the US and the Fed Chair Jerome Powell recently addressed questions about the longevity of this supply chain strain and these disruptions, and both indicated that it's going to take a while for things to settle, again, well into and throughout 2022. Okay, let's go ahead and shift gears a bit and talk about weather. As we head into the depths of the winter months, it is absolutely hard not to think about extreme weather, right? And climate change has been a huge topic of conversation in recent months. We've had a number of global summits focused on the climate crisis, bringing together governments around the world, making promises and pledges to try and curb the effects that we've already been seeing. The rise in these impacts from climate change are absolutely no surprise. We hear about more and more extreme weather events with each passing month. We certainly had our fair share of these jaw-dropping events and weather headlines that happened in 2021, extreme winter weather conditions knocking out power and water across Texas for days and even weeks in some areas. We had those record-breaking and deadly heat waves in the Pacific Northwest. Those impacted both the US and British Columbia. The worst flooding in Germany in decades earlier this year, and the list really does go on. And we just wrapped another record-breaking Atlantic hurricane season. And as we face down another winter season, we definitely look to forecasters and trends to really notate what we should expect in 2022. Our senior meteorologist tells me that for the second season in a row, we are going to get another La Nina winter pattern to contend with. What does that mean, right? La Nina, it's kind of a foreign word to most of us who aren't familiar with meteorology. So what exactly does that mean as we jump into 2022? Well, the temperature predictions are interesting. The southern US, the southeast in particular, are looking to be warmer than average, while below average temps are expected in the Pacific Northwest and the northern plains in particular. But I would really note that the most interesting and likely much more significant coming out of forecasts for the upcoming season is related to the precipitation that's going to be caused by this La Nina pattern. So wetter than average conditions are expected in the north. And we're already seeing this in the Pacific Northwest. Again, kind of like the trend lines from last year, both the US and parts of Canada, British Columbia in particular. If you listened to the weather recently, you've probably heard headlines and references to atmospheric rivers. These aren't necessarily unusual phenomenons for those parts of the globe, but we have definitely been seeing more consecutive events back to back to back. And that quick succession has already led to devastating flooding, evacuations, landslides. We are definitely likely to see this trend continue into early 2022. The Southwest, on the other hand, is forecast to have below normal precipitation, so particularly areas that have already been suffering from drought conditions. I actually took a look at the latest drought outlook and predictions recently, and unfortunately, it's going to continue in this direction. And forecasters are also noting that areas that are not currently suffering from drought conditions could see impacts, specifically as we look at central Texas and Oklahoma, westward throughout the southern Rockies. So we'll definitely be taking a close look and seeing some expectations there this year as well. And with this expected lack of precipitation in regions impacted most by wildfires, it's clear that we are looking ahead to another active and devastating wildfire season in 2022. It's really important for businesses in these regions to take this into consideration in preparedness and planning for the upcoming year. All right, shifting gears and topics a bit again. So cybersecurity, it is definitely extremely important to note when we look ahead to 2022. So with so many other threats and the pandemic consuming us, this is definitely a topic that can sometimes get lost in the mix. The rise in attacks in recent years, however, and high profile attacks, but that, to be honest, have really continued to push cyber crimes and ransom attacks and awareness of these events consistently. And that's a good thing. More awareness is always a good thing. Just this past year, we saw, right, the targeting of the US gas pipeline pipeline, the Colonial Pipeline, and all those impacts. People are, of course, very familiar now with the name SolarWinds. The meat manufacturing industry was hit, health facilities, both in the US and Europe. Again, this list could go on and on. There's an interesting headline that I actually read from a study from earlier this year that's really interesting to note. Nearly 80% of leaders in IT don't believe their company is sufficiently protected from cyber attacks. And that fear prompted budgets to nearly double last year. And I imagine that this will continue to spark business preparedness trends, and rightfully so, right? These are definitely things that we should be very concerned about as we continue to move into 2022. The cost of damages for this past year was actually projected to top $6 trillion globally. And when you just look ahead a few years, those projections get even more concerning and devastating. Experts say that by 2025, we're going to see costs move more closely to $10 trillion. And if you're looking to dive a bit deeper on cybersecurity and best practices in preparedness here, I'd highly suggest taking a listen to a recent podcast that Peter did with a cybersecurity expert named Dax Streeter. They discussed actionable insights on developing an effective cybersecurity program. Definitely take a listen to that. The final thing that I would really stress around all the threats and the trends we've seen over the past year and the coming 2022, the best thing anyone can do is to be prepared, right? That's the best thing that all of us can take into consideration is how we can better prepare and to understand the changing landscape. There's many things that businesses and business leaders can do to stay educated, really to continuously seek out information, right? Both in the moment on kinetic events, but also take into consideration future events that are coming up. Well, that wraps it up for me. It was definitely a pleasure taking over for Peter today, and I hope you have all gained some valuable insights that can really help you to prepare your organization and your employees for the business year to come. Thank you all for listening to the Employee Safety Podcast. I certainly wish you and your families, your businesses, your employees a healthy, happy, and safe new year. Until next time.
Alert Media is changing the way your leaders and response teams connect and communicate effectively when seconds matter. We provide our customers with a comprehensive solution for monitoring threats around the world and deploying fast, effective emergency communication. You need a panic-proof solution for high-stakes moments. In just a few clicks, your team can send a multi-channel notification to an impacted group of people and confirm their safety immediately. When employee safety is at stake, don't just communicate. Connect and confirm with a robust emergency communication solution. Visit alertmedia.com for more information. You've been listening to the Employee Safety Podcast. To ensure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. If you're listening in Apple Podcasts, we'd love for you to give a quick rating of the show. Just tap the number of stars you think the podcast deserves. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.